In 1959, NASA introduced 7 American pilots to the world, the men who would carry the name Mercury Astronauts, and strive to carry the banner of the United States as some of the first human beings to travel into space. They were viewed as heroes and role models to a nation that desperately needed both. But of those 7, one who would shy away from the spotlight the most would end up being the man who would contribute the most. Donald Kent Slayton, known to his friends as Deke, born on March 1st, 1924. A farm boy from Sparta, Wisconsin, Deke would enlist in the Army Air Forces as a cadet shortly after high school in 1942. It would take only a year for him to gain pilot wings, and would go on to fly 56 combat missions in Europe as a B-25 bomber pilot, and 7 more in Japan in the A-26 Invader. He returned to the United States before war's end in 1944, where he would serve as an instructor pilot, and after war's conclusion, spent 4 years achieving a Bachelor of Science degree in Aeronautical Engineering from the University of Minnesota. From here, he would spend 2 years with Boeing Aircraft Corporation before being recalled to active duty in 1951, serving portions of the Korean War in Germany as a fighter pilot. Returning to the States again in 1955, Slayton would attend and graduate from the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School, after which he would find his way, as many test pilots would, to Edwards Air Force Base in California. In this historic facility, already famous by this time, he would test several Air Force fighters from the F-101 through F-106 lineage, logging over 7,000 hours of flying time through his career, 5,000 of which in jets. 1959 would become the fateful year in which Slayton would become one of 110 military test pilots selected to try out for the crazy experiment called Project Mercury. Like many test pilots, going faster and higher was all he lived for, and here was a chance to fly into space, flying faster than even gravity could resist. From a field of the greatest test pilots America had to offer, Slayton was selected as one of the 7 absolute best, a personal achievement that could not be rivaled. It would not be smooth sailing from here, of course, as the competition to get the first ride was even tougher than to be named a Mercury astronaut in the first place. And the man that Slayton could tell would be the guy to beat was none other than Alan Shepard, the man who would eventually win the right to be America's first man in space. Though training for flights was not the only responsibility, as each member of the 7 were given specific tasks within Project Mercury to oversee. In this case, Slayton would oversee booster development, specifically boosters that would hopefully take Mercury from the simple suborbital flights to actually achieving orbit, and this was no easy task. The 3 names on NASA's shortlist, Shepard, Grissom, and Glenn, were certainly household names across America, and their flights were historic for many different reasons. So who would it be to follow up the 3 American heroes? Slayton, of course. And now he had the job of making America's 2nd orbital flight, and this time without the pesky landing bag switch error. Just surviving the endeavor made Glenn a legend, and now it was time for Slayton to make history in the craft he named Delta 7.
Is that your capsule sitting back there?
Yes, it is.
How do you feel about it being out in the elements here this afternoon?
I don't mind it being in the elements if somebody was working on it.
You're raring to go.
Yes, sir.
As a test pilot, Deke trained to face danger head-on and overcome any problem in the air. As an astronaut, he trained to recover the mission from any conceivable malfunction. But what was the one thing that he just could not train for or overcome? His own heart. For years, Slayton had an irregular heartbeat, yet no other symptoms attributed to it. He had always performed beyond exemplary in the air. He had passed every physical stress test the scientific community knew how to do on the human body. He mastered every simulator. And yet only now, months before his flight, NASA doctors got nervous.
This is a diagnosis of paroxysmal atrial fibrillation.
The only decision that has been made is that Deke will not take the next mission in the MA-7.
Slayton was grounded, removed from flight rotation with no indication of when or even if he would ever get a flight assignment again.
They can't do this to me. I mean, he kept saying that over and over again. They can't do this to me. This isn't fair. He was very, very, very upset and very angry and very hurt because career meant so much to him. To be an astronaut meant so much to him.
That same year, the Air Force responded in a similar fashion, grounding Slayton from flight status indefinitely. The worst news that any pilot could hear, and through no fault of his own. A physical condition beyond his control, with no solution, no loophole, and no convincing the doctors regardless of how well he performs. One of the greatest pilots that America has ever seen was not allowed to fly. The Mercury astronauts marched to their own drummer, and the NASA brass began to feel they were a little too difficult to control. With this, they decided that the astronauts should have some kind of chaperone to manage their activities to a greater degree and basically keep the hot jock pilots in line. Naturally, that didn't sit too well with the men who knew the eyes of the country were on them, and without them, there would be no space program. They didn't want some army general walking around like a mother hen all hours of the day. It would be Shepard who first came up with the idea that if they were to have someone to take the position of coordinator of astronaut activities, it should be Slayton, one of their own, a man with whom they had trained and trusted, and even when they were all competing for the same seat in the cockpit. Perhaps they thought that he would be a figurehead and things wouldn't change, but Slayton would quickly show how seriously he would take this new role.
They thought with Deke that he would simply be the Wisconsin farm boy that would come in and sort of a figurehead. But they didn't know what a manager and what type of a person Deke Slayton was, what a doer he was.
This new position would soon be called Chief of the Astronaut Office, and oftentimes even simplified to Chief Astronaut. How appropriate that title would be, now that one of the boys was in charge, and not some bureaucrat with stars on his shoulders. It would be one of the boys who would give Slayton his first serious test in his new job. From the very beginning, Gordo Cooper had been a bit of a hothead, arguably the toughest to control of all the 7. When trying to make a point, Cooper had made a low flyby pass of the administration building, flying even below the altitude of the flight director's office. Livid by this action, NASA was pressured to pull Cooper from flight rotation and have Shepard fly in his stead. As it turns out, as part of this new chief astronaut position, it would be Slayton's job to select the astronaut crews, not NASA management. Slayton knew that if Cooper was removed from the flight, it would all but completely destroy his astronaut career. Standing firm, Slayton continued to push for the flight rotation to stay as is, and for Cooper to remain in for the final flight of Mercury. NASA could see the kind of man Slayton was, and that he was going to be a formidable force in his position. So much, in fact, that a brand new position within NASA management was created specifically for him, Director of Flight Crew Operations. Around this time, with several new classes of astronauts to oversee, and knowing that he would never fly again, Slayton finally resigned his commission from the Air Force, and remained with NASA as a civilian. From here, he became instrumental in organizing the flight rotation through the new Gemini program, which suffered issues from the very beginning. Originally, Alan Shepard was set to fly the first 2-man Gemini flight with Tom Stafford at his side. When Shepard suffered an ear infection and was himself grounded, a couple things happened. Since the new flight crews trained so closely together, Deke felt it was best to not split the crews up. So when Shepard was grounded, Stafford lost his seat as well, and the flight of Gemini 3 instead went to Gus Grissom and John Young. Further, a position had opened up. The job of Chief of the Astronaut Office, which Slayton had quickly offered to Shepard, the man who had originally offered him the job in the first place. 2 Mercury astronauts no longer allowed to fly, now working side by side at the very top. Through the Gemini program, the crews were set up in a rotating schedule to allow maximum training time, a clear progression, and a system that could be universally perceived as fair for all involved. As Slayton set up this position, initially a two-man crew would serve as backup for the first flights, commanded by Mercury veterans, and if their performance was satisfactory, they would advance to prime crew 3 missions later. Stafford, for example, who was removed from Gemini 3, would train as backup with Mercury veteran Wally Schirra, after which both men would subsequently fly Gemini 6. It wasn't always as simple as that. When the Gemini 9 crew Elliot C. and Charles Bassett died in a plane crash, it required not only the backup crew to take their place, but a shuffling of the flight rotation to get an appropriate second backup team, who themselves would advance to fly Gemini 12. This change would have a direct impact upon the upcoming Apollo program, designed to send the first human beings to the moon. Before finalizing the Apollo rotation, Slayton would call a meeting of the 18 names selected for rotation. Among these 18 names were the remaining members of the Mercury 7, the new 9, and the third group of 14. He would stand before them, and after a quick breakdown of how the Apollo strategy would progress, he made it plain and simple. The men in the room would be making the moon landings. He didn't know which two would be first, and he didn't care, as each of them were equally qualified. Of course, he knew there was one man who was better than all the rest, but Slayton couldn't fly. And this unfortunately continued to frustrate him, though he continued to perform his job the best way he knew how. And that job would suddenly become a very painful one, when Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee perished in the fire of Apollo 1. Gus was a dear friend by this time, both working and training closely for 8 years now. How deeply the loss affected Slayton personally is something that only he would know, but it is known that he spent the night at a bar with Frank Borman, drinking almost to excess, understandably so. They knew they would lose someone, someday, but not on the ground. That was not the way to die, not for a test pilot. It was time to put fear, doubt, and sadness aside, to forge ahead and accomplish the mission. For Gus. The Apollo 1 backup crew now advanced to the prime crew, and would successfully fly the redesigned command module into orbit a year and a half later. It was time to start pushing toward the moon, but it would be the following flight of Apollo 8 that would put Slayton in a position to make decisions that would directly impact the eventual moon landing. The lunar module was not complete, and it was not going to be anytime soon. Even as the first manned flight, Apollo 7, concluded, the next mission was meant to test the lunar module in Earth orbit. But until the LEM was ready to fly, Apollo 8 could not proceed. And if they waited, it would leave only 9 months to make 4 successful flights in order to reach Kennedy's lunar goal. With the help of mission planners, Slayton made a decision that would not only keep the flights going, but ultimately determine who would make the first steps upon the moon. The crew assigned to Apollo 8 were Jim McDivitt, David Scott, and Rusty Schweikart, whom had trained with the lunar module for nearly a year. Their backup crew was Pete Conrad, Dick Gordon, and Alan Bean. This would have put them as the prime crew for Apollo 11. The crew of Apollo 9, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, were training for a lunar orbit flight, and further test the lunar module there. In this mission, the LEM was only a secondary objective, and since the LEM wasn't ready, Slayton's final decision was to swap. Have Borman's crew fly Apollo 8 without the LEM, so McDivitt's crew could put their training time to use on Apollo 9 once it was ready to go. Borman's backups? Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. It was this decision that would give Armstrong the honor of being the first man on the moon, and not Pete Conrad. Of course, whether it be the historic flight of Apollo 11 or the pinpoint landing of Apollo 12, all Slayton could think of was how lucky these guys were to get to do it. But luck would have little to do with it when suddenly Alan Shepard, who had become Deke's best friend by this time, had come knocking on the door asking for command of Apollo 13. Without anyone knowing, Shepard had undergone an experimental surgery to cure his ear infection, and Slayton all too eagerly slipped Shepard and his hand-picked crew right back into flight rotation, until NASA rejected his selection for the first time since taking the job. Another crew shuffle took place, swapping Jim Lovell's crew with Shepard's, and after proving themselves with their diligent training regimen, NASA finally agreed, and America's first astronaut made his way to the moon on Apollo 14. Slayton couldn't be happier for his old buddy, and now he was more determined than ever to get his own ride. He exercised daily, quit smoking, stopped drinking coffee, drastically reduced alcohol, and started taking massive amounts of vitamins, within medical reason, of course. By mid-1970, it seemed as if the fibrillation had finally ceased. Though NASA doctors were not quite convinced and underwent a massive and comprehensive study of Slayton's heart, to a far greater degree than anyone else in the astronaut corps would ever have to suffer through. By the time he was finally restored to flight status, it was too late. The crews for all Apollo lunar flights were finalized, even though the 3 final flights were eventually canceled. Slayton would not be able to accomplish what his friend Al had. Apollo was over, and the long-duration flights of Skylab were considered too much of a risk. It seemed as if his return to flight status was all for naught. But then there was one more mission left, a mission of multinational cooperation, the Apollo-Soyuz test project. And no matter how worried NASA doctors would get, there was no way Deke was passing up this opportunity. Flight director Chris Kraft minces no words in how he felt at the time.
We knew more about Deke Slayton's heart than any person we ever flew. And that goddamn doctor stood up in the meeting and said, well, we know we've said that before, but if he fibrillates on the pad, we're going to stop the count. And I fired that son of a bitch.
When Deke was able to finally get approval to fly again, I was just so delighted for him, so happy. And I thought, well, this guy really wants to fly. He's even going to learn how to speak Russian so he can fly in space.
Boris,
All of us wanted to be first at something. Maybe there was some poetic justice there in Deke's case, that he got to make the first joint mission with the Soviets.
As docking module pilot for the Apollo spacecraft, unofficially named Apollo 18, Deke Slayton would train hand-in-hand with another veteran of the earliest days, Alexei Leonov, member of the first class of Soviet cosmonauts, a man whom had been with the program since the very beginning, witnessing all the glorious triumphs and suffering through horrific losses, just like Deke. These two became fast friends during their training, as political borders and rivalries were made absolutely meaningless. Then the final moment came, halfway through 1975, the true ending to the space race. Not with a scramble for the finish line, but with handshakes of shared triumph. Apollo 18 takes Deke Slayton on his first ever spaceflight, an experience he thought he may never have, and what an experience it was. As Apollo makes orbit, Deke couldn't help but comment,
"Man, I tell you, this is worth waiting 16 years for."
In a way, the perfect ending. The man who would be instrumental in the decision-making process that would shape the entire Apollo program, flying the mission that would see its final conclusion. Though this would be his only flight in space, his career didn't end here. He remained with NASA during development of the Space Shuttle, and became the head of the division responsible for its approach and landing tests. And later, upon its readiness for actual spaceflight, he served as manager for orbital flight test, directing the operations, scheduling, planning, readiness reviews, and post-flight evaluations of the first test flights of the brand new orbiter vehicle. Slayton finally retired from NASA in 1982, continuing to serve as consultants for several aerospace groups, including a Houston-based company called Space Services Incorporated, that would successfully launch the world's first privately funded rocket. The final time Slayton's name would appear was in 1994. In both a book entitled Moonshot: The Inside Story of America's Race to the Moon and a PBS documentary of the same name, portions of which were included in this very program, he would unfortunately not see either of these projects completed, dying of cancer in 1993. Both of these projects instead became tributes to his life and legacy. And an incredible legacy at that. Doubtless one of the greatest in the hearts and minds of all who lived through those first decades of manned spaceflight. A legacy that will forever mark this week in space history.